90-pound rucksack. Story of the 10th Mountain Division and the dawn of outdoor recreation in America. Episode 2, The State of the Art, Part 1. Welcome back to 90-pound rucksack. I'm your host, Christian Beckwith, and boy, am I excited you're here for this episode. There is so much to unpack. So if you're just tuning in, here's a quick recap to bring you up to speed. 90-pound rucksack is the story of the 10th Mountain Division told in two ways. An advisory board of the 10th's foremost experts help ensure the podcast's historical accuracy, but we're also weaving in the narrative nonfiction account of First Lieutenant John Andrew McCown II, a young man who learned to climb in the Tetons, joined the division at its inception, and rose through the ranks to become one of its greatest unsung heroes. John's story is part of a book I'll release upon the podcast's conclusion. Its factual foundation, including the recreation of events found in this episode, relies on first-person sources. Where such sources are unavailable, civilian and military histories of the unit, and input from the 10th Mountain Division community help us to fill in the gaps. In Episode 0, we recounted how the discovery of John's story led to the genesis of 90-pound rucksack. In our last episode, Episode 1, we examined how the 1939 Soviet invasion of Finland, the National Ski Patrol System, the U.S. Army, and the American Alpine Club converged in their efforts to develop America's very first mountain unit. Okay, so now buckle up because we're about to begin our exploration of the state of climbing and skiing in America and Europe before the war. To give each element the attention it deserves, we're breaking this episode into two parts. Part 1 here today will drill down into the history of skiing in America. Part 2, which we'll release next month, will provide a deeper analysis of climbing before the war, explore the history of European mountain troops, and detail how the rise of the Third Reich caused some of the best German and Austro-Hungarian mountaineers to emigrate, influencing climbing and skiing on this side of the Atlantic, and contributing to the 10th Mountain Division's fighting skills. So if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the show so you don't miss an episode, and please consider becoming a patron. Not only do patrons help to underwrite all our research for the show, they get access to our unabridged content, which includes exclusive interviews, historical documents, supporting materials, and incredible photos that illustrate each episode. To become a patron, just go on over to christianbeckwith.com and click the Patreon button. It's easy, and it makes it possible for us to continue this exciting and important work. A quick call out to the American Alpine Club for supporting our podcast today. The American Alpine Club has been supporting climbers and preserving climbing history for more than 120 years. AAC members receive rescue insurance and medical expense coverage, providing peace of mind on committing objectives. They also get copies of the AAC's world-renowned publications, the American Alpine Journal, and Accidents in North American Climbing. And they can explore climbing history by diving into the AAC's Mountaineering Library. Learn more about the club and benefits of membership at AmericanAlpineClub.org. And get a taste of the best of AAC content by listening to the bi-monthly American Alpine Club podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or SoundCloud. The golden oven stood out like an inverted dimple on an otherwise smooth rock wall. It was August 3rd, 1939, and 21-year-old John McCown was perched 40 feet above a bone-shattering ledge on the Grand Teton-Sexham Ridge, 12,500 feet above sea level in the pale blue Wyoming sky. He pasted the felt sole of his right climbing shoe on a great convexity, fingered a flaring crack for purchase, and scanned the stone for alternatives. There were none. The dimpled nubbin was the sole feature in a 4-foot radius, and not much of one at that. John looked down at the ledge below. It was strewn with shards of talus and broken rock. To the east, the view dropped away thousands of feet to the plains of Jackson's Hole. The serrated architecture of the Grand Teton's southern walls crowded the vista to the west, with Pierre's Hole in Idaho shimmering in the heat just beyond. He'd never been so high or exposed. He wished they'd brought a rope. Glenn Exum didn't use a rope on the first descent. His partner, Joe Hawks, had argued the night before, his angular face twitching in the firelight. Paul Petzoldt didn't either, on the second. Climbed it right after him, the same day, handed off his clients to Glenn on the descent, and practically ran up the route. Perhaps it had been the second bottle of beer that had convinced John of his partner's logic. Maybe it was the warm blanket of dancing flames that had fogged his thinking. Whatever the reason, they'd left the rope behind in Grand Teton National Park's Jenny Lake Campground at 6 that morning. And now, 5 hours, 7 miles, and more than 5,500 vertical feet later, Joe was somewhere above, having climbed out of sight, and John was nervously eyeing the terrain ahead of him, wishing they'd brought a rope. Son of a bitch, John muttered to himself. His fingers were starting to sweat. He blinked, searching for another hold, but all he could see was the nubbin. The speckled stone all around him was coarse and warm from the sun. John had rolled the sleeves of his white cotton shirt past his elbows, but even with the light breeze blowing in from the west, he could still feel the sweat on his back, soaking into his campus rucksack as he studied the rock for clues. All around him, bands of feldspar and quartz arced and swirled in interlocking patterns of tawny-colored rock, rough as a lion's tongue after 2 billion years of metamorphosis. Zebra stripes of white and black silicate alternated with waves of bronze. It was like climbing in a cosmos of foliated granite. He was glad he'd worn his cletter shoes. The tricuni nails of his climbing boots would have skittered around on the rock like metal on glass. Maybe there was a feature he'd missed. Maybe there was an edge for his foot hiding somewhere on the wall. He blinked, stared. There wasn't. John looked up. Joe had moved through the section so easily, John hadn't paid attention. Now he was nowhere to be seen, and the grand summit lay out of sight too, hundreds of feet above. How long had he been stuck here without moving? 30 seconds? A minute? Maybe longer. Cumulus clouds decorated the sky in long gauzy trains, running their suspended outlines over the plains and peaks to the east in lazy shadows. He didn't know if he could do this. Keep going, a voice within him said, so softly it could have been the wind. John pressed his right palm to the weathered textured matrix of golden stone for balance, then stretched left for the nubbin, pinching it between his fingers. With no other holds for purchase, he slowly raised his left foot up to the level of his hand. Ever so delicately, he straightened, shifting right, pressing against the wall to maintain equilibrium until he was standing. His right foot was pasted to nothing, but he was centered, upright. He would never be able to reverse the moves he just made. The premise of 90-Pound Rucksack is that we're not only telling the story of the 10th Mountain Division, we're exploring the origins of outdoor recreation in America as well. John McCown offers insights into both, in part by helping to illustrate who was climbing and skiing before the war. On the day he found himself so delicately positioned on the Exum Ridge, John's love of the outdoors was about to go through an exponential leap. The Exum Ridge was not only the Grand's most famous route, it was the first real climbing route John had ever been on. For most people, even today, the exertion necessary to climb the Grand in a 24-hour period is enough to shift one's perspective. Since leaving the valley floor 4 hours earlier, John had been engaged in the rock climbing sections of the route for barely an hour when he found himself balanced atop one of the signature moves on a signature section of the route called the friction pitch that is devoid of in-cut holds. Years of athletics had quickened John's response times, but nothing had prepared him for the mind-altering move off the nubbin. The man who had left camp that morning without a rope was young and vigorous, a bystander to the world unfolding before him because he knew no other way. The man who had returned to it later that day would no longer be a bystander. In his next few moves off the nubbin, John would brush up against a previously unknown dimension, wherein his own actions determine which side of the line between life and death he would inhabit. Never before had he imagined a situation that was both so mesmerizing and terrible in its allure, and he instantly wanted more, and that would have implications not only for him, but for the 10th Mountain Division, the U.S. Army's assault on Hitler's Gothic Line, and the outcome of World War II in Europe. 6'2" and square-jawed, with broad shoulders, olive skin, and dark hair, John had been born on the 4th of July in 1918 in Washington, D.C. His father, Andrew, was a prominent corporate lawyer in Philadelphia. His mother, Mary, came from successful entrepreneurs on both sides of the family. Her parents had built a family summer camp near Dingman's Ferry in the Poconos, where Andrew, an active sportsman, had instilled his love for the outdoors in his 4 sons, as he taught them to hunt, fish, backpack, and camp. John was the oldest. He was whip-smart, mischievous, funny, and bow-legged, which saved him from being a cliché because he was also good-looking. He was a sort of strapping young man who, from the outside, seemed both charmed and charming. But as with all people, John's outward appearance offered little insight into his inner workings, and they were troubled, as most people's are, by the circumstances he couldn't control. John and his brothers, Grove, Dick, and Andrew, had been raised in a big house in Germantown, Pennsylvania, a well-to-do suburb in the northwestern corner of Philadelphia. They'd all attended private schools, first Germantown Academy and then William Penn Charter. And John had run track and played baseball and football and lacrosse until the sports had fleshed out his frame. He was a good student, polite and considerate with his parents and strangers alike, and an affectionate teacher had taught him and Grove to ski on winter vacations in New Hampshire. Natural athletes both, they took to the sport with ease. But it was a chance encounter with falconry that had caught John's heart, and that had come to define his teenage years. Andrew was 5 years John's junior, the youngest in the McCown family household. Grove, the second oldest, and Dick, the third, were as naturally gifted as John was, and loved all the same things, the sports and the hunting and the camping and the singing, a love they'd inherited from their father, who sang first tenor with the Orpheus Club of Philadelphia. But not Andrew. He didn't have the stamina. He loved butterflies, and their father had given him a Winchester .22 pump rifle for his 12th birthday, but he didn't have the heart to shoot the chipmunks and squirrels and crows and turkeys the way his brothers did. So John, who was sweeter on him than his other brothers, taught Andrew to hawk the way his high school teacher had taught him, holding Andrew's arm up while the raptors learned to feed from his hand. But hawking exhausted Andrew too. Everything had, since he developed leukemia. Their father had made it clear to his boys that he expected them to follow him into the family practice. Not Andrew, of course. Andrew was too ill for dreams. But Dick, Grove, and John most of all had had their lives set out for them by their father, and they'd done as he decreed. Following William Penn, John had gone to the University of Pennsylvania, where he was currently studying at the Wharton School. Law school was next. It was the family way. Except John didn't want to study law, and he didn't want to work in his father's firm. From an early age, he loved the outdoors most of all, scrambling around on cliffs in the Poconos, and losing himself in the forts and fantasy fights he'd concocted for him and his brothers to play. Falconry had accelerated that love in a way so fierce it made his breathing thin, and soon all he'd wanted to do was climb trees in search of nests. He'd brought Grove along with him, and they'd practiced shimmying down the side of their house in Germantown with a hemp rope, then telling Dick and Andrew about their adventures after their parents had gone to bed. Being outside, particularly with his birds, offered John an escape that had become like an addiction. He wanted to be free like them, beautiful, flawless, soaring high above his father's expectations and Andrew's illness, with effortless maneuverability and quick bursts of speed. But he didn't know how to be free, and so every day he returned to the ordinary rhythms of school and sport and family, as one returns to waking from a dream. And then on July 27th, 1938, Andrew died. He was 14. Their parents didn't speak of his death, much as they'd never spoken of his illness. Lacking a vocabulary with which to discuss their loss, the boys didn't either. John retreated into his falconry, which offered both catharsis and an escape from the life he'd been groomed to inherit. The summer trip out west had been his parents' idea. Give the boys some space, let them hunt and fish and breathe in the wide western landscape, until the fog that had enveloped them broke apart. With John's Cooper's hawk hooded and perched atop a bar across the back seat of their 1937 Ford Woody wagon, he and Grove, 2 years his junior and 5 inches shorter, had left Germantown on June 19th with their brother Dick, who was 16 and shared their dark skin, dark hair, athletic frame, and bow-legged stance. They'd headed west, through West Virginia and Illinois and Missouri, stopping for repairs when a pin dropped out of the drive shaft twice, and sleeping in the back of the car. On June 21st in Hannibal, Missouri, after regaling onlookers at the Ford dealership with his hawk, John was invited to give a speech about it at the Lions Club. On June 22nd, car fixed, they drove 570 miles in a push, and camped on the side of the road outside of Denver. John bought a black Stetson hat with a 2.5-inch rim for $7.50. The next day, they dropped Dick off at a summer camp for boys in Estes Park, then continued north through the high summits of the Rocky Mountains, still blanketed with snow and more magnificent than anything they'd ever seen, toward the Tetons, where they planned to spend 3 or 4 days with a family friend before heading out for the trip's ultimate objective, Washington's Mount Baker. They'd come to ski, something they'd figured would be in abundant supply among the snowy summits of the West. They'd fallen in love with speed during the winter holidays in New Hampshire. And when John found an article on summertime skiing on Mount Baker's glaciers, there was nothing that could dissuade them from their goal. But as they were driving west out of Jackson's Hole, up Teton Pass, they were pulled over by Fred Brown, 6 feet tall and slim almost to the point of frailty, who'd noticed the skis on top of their car when they'd driven past his house and roared up from behind them to cut them off. Did they know about the second annual 4th of July ski race, taking place the next day in Paintbrush Canyon, deep in Grand Teton National Park? They didn't. They'd looked at each other, then at the man with the bright blue eyes that bulged manically below elliptical eyebrows, who was bending over to interrogate them through the window of their own car. Brown, who they'd soon learn was Grand Teton National Park ski operator, Wyoming State ski champion, and an indefatigable promoter of all things skiing, insisted they stay at his house that night and compete in the race the next day, which happened to coincide with John's 21st birthday. How do I know all of this? Because Susan McCown, who was John's niece and Grove's daughter, shared with me the letters that the brothers wrote almost every day, all summer long, to their parents. The letters paint a portrait of 2 endearing young men who are falling increasingly in love with the mountains. And yet, even as I pored over their letters and cross-referenced them with details gleaned from a conversation with Fred's son, and another with his protege, and newspaper clippings and park reports, and Teton Summit Register entries from the climbing season, it seems strange to me that in the summer of 1939, just a few short months before the Soviet Union invaded Finland and launched the Winter War, a ski race was being held in Grand Teton National Park on the 4th of July. It seems stranger still that early that morning, John and Grove were joined by 50 other skiers, cowboys, and cowgirls for the 6-mile hike into Paintbrush Canyon's Holly Lake, below the southwest slopes of 11,555-foot Mount Woodring, where the race was to occur. For one thing, skiing and summer vacations take money. In America, as the post-World War I economic boom of the Roaring '20s led to the widespread adoption of the automobile and the expansion of train routes throughout the country, people had turned to recreation as a way to spend their money, and the wealthy in particular had become enamored of skiing. But then in October 1929, the stock market collapsed, and a decade of economic calamity ensued. I knew how John and Grove had managed to make their way to the Tetons. They were rich. But what about the 4 dozen other people who were following Fred, the Pied Piper of Teton skiing, into the hills? By 1933, when the Great Depression reached its nadir, nearly half the country's banks had failed, and some 15 million Americans, a quarter of the working-age population, were out of a job. Even those lucky enough to keep theirs were up against it, as wage income fell more than 42% between 1929 and 1933. In the 100 days following his March 1933 inauguration, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration reformed the financial system, passed legislation that created jobs, stabilized industrial and agricultural production, and began to stimulate the nation's economic recovery. Over the next 3 years, the gross domestic product grew at an average rate of 9% per year. But in 1937, another economic depression wiped out much of the previous gains, and though the economy had begun to improve by the time the McCowns reached the Tetons, the country was by no means out of the economic woods. For another thing, Jackson, Wyoming, population 1,000 in 1939, was geographically isolated. Tucked away as it was in Wyoming's northwestern corner, Jackson wasn't reachable by rail, and driving to the town in the 1930s required a level of commitment difficult to imagine by today's standards. Still, in 1929, the year Grand Teton National Park was established, 51,500 people visited the area. By 1938, despite the Depression, that number had swollen to 153,353. It dipped to 87,133 in 1939 as the economy shuddered, but was back on the upswing by 1940 when 103,324 people visited the park. Are those big numbers or small numbers? Were the only people marching up Paintbrush Canyon to have a go at Fred Brown's harebrained race members of America's upper class? No. There was enough socioeconomic diversity in their ranks to illustrate that in America, at the end of the 1930s, it was more than just the wealthy who enjoyed the mountains. Among the party was Fred Brown's best friend, a 29-year-old bushy-eyebrowed ox of a man named Paul Petzoldt. Charismatic, with a booming voice and a bare-paw grip, Petzoldt had blue eyes, a thatch of dense brown hair, and enough character flaws to satisfy a Greek playwright. By 1939, Petzoldt's exploits as both a climber and a personality were already legendary. His first attempt on the Grand in 1924 as a 16-year-old farm boy from Twin Falls, Idaho, had ended in near calamity when he and his childhood friend, the 19-year-old Ralph Heron, had attempted the mountain's longest feature, the still unclimbed East Ridge, in cowboy boots and bib-top overalls with only a lasso rope and a pocket knife for equipment. Both had come in handy the next morning when they'd rappelled into, and then cut their way out of, an iced-up chimney they'd hoped would provide an escape from the storm that had left them buried in snow and ice overnight. I sometimes think now that the only reason we survived was because we did not know we were supposed to die, Petzoldt would later write. Too embarrassed to return to town without a summit, they'd managed to work their way around the mountain and climb it by its route of first ascent. Back in town, they were hailed as heroes, and Petzoldt had become the range's de facto guide when he took 3 parties of locals up the mountain over the next month. The following summer, he'd become its de facto rescuer when he caught Heron's fall with a lasso rope on the same East Ridge, then carried him off the mountain on his back. A week later, he oversaw the range's first body recovery when he retrieved Theodore Teepee from the glacier at the base of the Grand that now bears his name. Petzoldt had made the first winter ascent of the Grand Teton in December 1935 with his brother Eldon and Fred Brown. The following summer, he'd made the first ascent of the Grand's north face, the most fearsome alpine wall in the United States. Petzoldt had perfected the concept of layering after discovering the perils of cotton and the merits of wool the hard way, and he developed a form of mountain communication using short, distinct words, on belay, up rope, slack, climbing, that persists to this day. He'd also established the foundations of American mountain guiding with his Petzoldt School of Mountaineering, which actually taught clients how to climb, a direct repudiation of the European model and its focus on roping clients up and down a mountain without so much as a discussion of the how or the where or the why. All of these skills would be put to good use 3 years later in 1942 when he joined the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Hale and was put in charge of developing its mountain rescue system. Had Petzoldt simply been the sum of all the good things he brought to the world, his reputation would have been sterling. Such was not the case, for Petzoldt contained multitudes. In 1938, Petzoldt had been invited by Charlie Houston to join Bob Bates, Bill House, Richard Birdsall, Norman Streatfield, and himself for the first American Karakoram expedition to K2, the world's second highest peak. Oh, to have been a fly on the wall on that expedition. Bates and Houston were part of the Harvard Five, the group of young Americans we met in the last episode that included H. Adams Carter, Terry Moore, and Brad Washburn, who had helped to advance the standards of American mountaineering. Petzoldt had spent the summer of 1934 at Windsor Castle as a guest of one of his climbing clients, the private chaplain of the King and Queen of England. Though he dined with Fred Astaire and the Prince of Wales, Petzoldt hadn't finished college, and even in the ostensibly classless America, the tension between the elite and the commoner must have been palpable. Despite their social differences, the team worked well together. Greatly benefited by Petzoldt's experiences in both the Tetons and with Teton craft, to say nothing of his ample energies, they managed a successful reconnaissance of the Abruzzi Ridge. With Houston, Petzoldt descended to the team's highest point at around 26,000 feet, then continued to climb after Houston, exhausted, lay down to rest in the sun. Petzoldt reached a point 2,200 feet below the summit, higher than anyone had ever been. Post-climb, things got interesting. The affluent members of the team hired a bus and driver and made a tour of the journey home, driving from Rawalpindi to Afghanistan to Iran en route. Lacking his companion's financial latitude and curious about Eastern religions, Petzoldt decided to travel to India, where he eventually fell in with a doctor and Mrs. Johnson, two American expatriates who had joined a charismatic guru in his commune. Petzoldt's first wife, Bernice, he would go on to have three others, traveled to India to join her husband. Mrs. Johnson poisoned her food. Beatrice stopped eating and, a few days later, recovered. Petzoldt went to get a meal for his now ravenous wife. When Mrs. Johnson found out that the meal was intended for Beatrice, she demanded Petzoldt give it to her so she could take it to Beatrice herself. Petzoldt demurred. Mrs. Johnson grabbed a gun. Petzoldt bolted for the courtyard and ran smack into Dr. Johnson, killing him. Though Petzoldt was eventually acquitted of manslaughter, he exited the country using funds pulled together by Houston and Bates, who never saw the money again. As an aside, in 1940, there was a reunion of sorts of the K2 expedition in the Tetons. Bates, House, and Petzoldt climbed the north ridge of the Grand with Petzoldt's protege, Glenn Exum, and the American female climbing pioneer Elizabeth Cowles. This indicates they must not have been too crosswise with one another. But in 1997, at an American Alpine Club annual dinner, I sat beside Bob and his wife, Gail. For the entire evening, they told me the story of the 1938 K2 expedition. More accurately, they told me the story of Paul and the missing funds. 60 years after the fact, they were still pissed. Petzoldt was a force of nature. He was also complicated, suffering bouts of periodic depression that caused him to disappear from time to time, and launching and losing countless businesses over the course of his long career with business practices that would have made a former president blush. And he managed to piss people off with some regularity. Petzoldt was scrappy, but he hustled out of necessity. He lacked the financial safety net of the Ivy League climbers. Petzoldt was first and foremost a climber, but he could also ski. He had to. The ferociously cold and snowy winters of Jackson's Hole, as the valley, named for fur trapper and explorer Davy Jackson, was known, lasted from the end of October until May, leaving 200 to 300 inches on the valley floor and 500 inches higher in the mountains. Fur trappers had been using rudimentary wooden planks to navigate the valley in winter as early as the 1860s, and for the hardy souls who, starting in the late 1890s, called the place their year-round home, skiing was both transportation, roads were not plowed regularly until the mid-1930s, and one of the only diversions from cabin fever. Though Fred had pioneered ski touring in the Tetons in the early 1930s, intrepid skiers have been making journeys to and from town for years, from as far away as the outlying settlements of Moose and Moran, distances of 20 and 40 miles, respectively. Hell, in early December 1935, Paul and Bernice had skied 70 miles from Ashton, Idaho, over Teton Pass to a dude ranch they'd been hired to manage during a blizzard. The 70-mile journey had taken them 7 days. Here's what Petzoldt had to say about skiing in the 1930s.
I had not been a skier in my youth because there's not much snow on the lava beds down at Twin Falls, Idaho. And at that time, adventure skiing or skiing for fun was practically unknown. Of course, in those days, you'd been criticized for doing anything for fun because you're not supposed to have fun. You're supposed to be working. And going out into the outdoors, you had to produce something, bring back some wood or go out to herd cattle or something, but you didn't go out there to have fun. That was against the ethics of that day. But we did. We did.
Jackson's Hole was a hardscrabble ranching community in the 1930s, and like many of its residents, Petzoldt didn't have a lot of money, but he had heaps of mountain smarts and ingenuity, and he applied them both to skiing.
We were experimenting with skis. We were making ski wax out of honey and tar and lard and coal dust and whatever, trying to get something on skis that we could put on whenever the weather changed, so they would either glide like wind over water, or they would stick and wouldn't slide back so we could climb up hills with them. So I learned to ski, and we experimented with the old type of skis that we made ourselves from pieces of lodgepole pine, which was where we split the logs down the grains and then sawed them off or whittled them off, so we had long boards that looked like skis, and then we put them and boiled them in some water for a while and bent them up on the ends and held them there till they dried. And sort of we had an upper end, and then in those days we could find some old belts from thrashing machines, which were very sturdy, and we could put those on there so we could sort of put our feet in there and bundled up in the wintertime so they were very warm. And we could get a long pole made out of lodgepole pine again, which grows thin and strong and limber. And we would use that to push our way along on the skis in the wintertime. It was like paddling. You reached out the pole and you put it in and you rode down through the snow. And they were long, so they would stay up on top of the snow because people didn't have the mechanical means of building ski trails like they do now.
I knew that not everyone in the 1930s was making their own skis out of boiled wooden planks and their bindings out of rubber gaskets, but I was still unclear on the socioeconomic factors at play during the Depression and how they affected the state of American skiing. So I did what any curious skier doing a podcast on the skiers and climbers of the 10th Mountain Division would do. I called someone who did. Dr. E. John B. Allen is an 89-year-old professor emeritus of history at New Hampshire's Plymouth State University and the author of the book From Skisport to Skiing, 100 Years of an American Sport, 1840 to 1940. And because we want this episode to provide a solid foundation for our examination of the ways the 10th contributed to the evolution of outdoor recreation in America, I asked Dr. Allen to start from the beginning. He told me that prior to the advent of skiing in the country, outdoor recreation in the winter was limited to three things:
snowshoeing, tobogganing, and skating. The first time that Americans in the lower 48 see ski tracks is 1841 in Beloit, Michigan.
In its earliest incarnations, skiing was used primarily for utilitarian purposes, such as travel, hunting, and delivering the mail. But then, in the early 1800s, a massive wave of immigration began that would have profound implications for the sport. Between 1820 and 1920, more than 2 million Scandinavians came to America. More than 100,000 arrived in 1882 alone. They settled primarily in the Midwest, and they brought their traditional mode of travel with them.
The huge numbers of Scandinavian, particularly Norwegian immigrants, appear in the 1880s, 90s, right through to the First World War. And that is exactly the same time when Fridtjof Nansen crossed the lower half of Greenland. The actual crossing was 1888, but his book about it came out in 1890. So just as he was describing a kind of leftover Christian, healthy outdoors activity that would better body, soul, and not only just of himself, but his people that he met, even to the extent of having an effect on local village, local town, even local country. So you have these thousands of immigrants coming over who, when they strap on skis, they don't think in terms of Christian nationalism, but they do think in terms of health and enjoyment of the outdoors and so on. And this comes just at the same time that America is going through one of its great industrial sort of pushes.
The sort of skiing that Petzoldt and Brown liked to do, and that the McCown brothers would soon come to love, was not, by and large, a mechanized form of skiing. It was instead the kind of skiing that backcountry skiers enjoy today, ascending and descending under one's own power with little to interrupt the connection with the natural world. It's hard to find the right words in English for this sort of skiing, where the exertion of the body leads to a settling of the mind. So when I heard Dr. Allen talk about a concept, first described by Nansen, that lay at the heart of America's earliest chapter of skiing, I lit up, because it's the essence of the skiing the soldiers of the 10th would later learn to do.
The Norwegians have a term which has no equivalent in English. The actual term in skiing is skiidrett, And it's always translated as sport, but the Norwegians didn't have the word sport in the sense that we have it. Sport only comes when you've got organization and when you've got records to be broken and records to be made. And it comes to mean, let's say around 1900, that it is a foundation for a strong national country. And this is very important where Norway is concerned because it's been under the overlordship of Sweden for 100 years. Norwegian independence took place in 1905, precisely as this skiidrett was in full swing. Just at the time that the masses of not just hundreds of immigrants, but thousands of immigrants were coming over. As far as nationalism was concerned, it was extremely important because here was a new country. And this new country had eternal snow. And there was a real romantic connection between the nationalism of Norway and the actual political success of the state. And Nansen was the person who really described it best of all. He talked of it in terms of wiping the soul clean, of getting out into nature and God's great universe, and making of it something for yourself as a better person, which would then affect kith, kin, village, town. And indeed, it is, as he said, it is something that is perhaps really important where the national psyche is concerned.
In America, at the turn of the century, Norwegian quickly became the lingua franca of the pursuit.
It was very much a club activity, and that club activity was run basically by Norwegian immigrants. In many ways, you had to go along with the Norwegian styles of skiing, the Norwegian way of measuring jumps, the general sort of aspect of skiing was more or less entirely Norwegian. The U.S. National Ski Association was founded in Ishpeming, which is in the UP of Michigan, in 1905. And they immediately started a magazine. What was it called? The Skisport, skiidrett. I can remember reading a fairly long article in the Skisport. It was in Norwegian. 2 lines at the bottom. These are the rules of jumping, and they will be obeyed. That was in English.
There were 2 kinds of Norwegian skiing, cross-country and jumping. In America, one quickly eclipsed the other in terms of popularity.
In Norway, even in the late 19th century, the idea was that a good skier was an all-round skier. The Norwegians had a major meet at Holmenkollen, and until 1933, a man who wanted to enter the competitions had to do both cross-country and jumping. It was only in 1933 that they were allowed, if they were a jumping specialist, just to jump in the competition and didn't have to worry about cross-country racing. But what happened in the United States was that jumping became a real crowd puller. I would almost say that in the Midwest, ski jumping almost turned skiing into a spectator sport. When there was a jump meet, trains would come in, some little town of maybe 1,000 people would suddenly have an influx of 8,000 people coming to watch maybe 16 jumpers. And that sort of attitude also produces professionalism. And one of the things about idrett was it was supposed to be so pure, so unprofessional, so full of godliness rather than money. Increasingly, the people in charge of Norwegian skiing out there in the National Ski Association had to realize that there was enough people around to have a professional class as well as boys' classes and men's classes and so on.
Ski jumping's popularity had profound implications for cross-country skiing.
And it almost failed over here. I have read a number of reports where it says things like the Finn boys, the Finn boys are going to run a race. Anybody that wants to can join. And if you want to use 2 sticks, you can. The Norwegian way was either to have no sticks or poles, that is. And then the sort of result would be that the race attracted 10 people. And the winner was expected to be some local guy, but he'd been in the United States too long and had just grown fat. So he was red in the face. It was that was the sort of, that's what happened. And when you look at the statistics for national championships, but in one particular year, probably 1916, 15, 16, 17, somewhere around about there, there were no takers for a national championship in cross-country skiing.
On June 8, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife while they were in Sarajevo, Bosnia, which was then part of Austria-Hungary. Within 2 months, Europe found itself embroiled in the First World War, which had implications for both the future of ski troops and the future of skiing.
During that war, there had been a fair amount of action in a comparatively few places. One of the places was the Italian front in the Dolomites. Ski troops and ski trooping after the war had a sort of a foundation in one sense. In another sense, there was a real foundation, particularly among the Austrians and the Germans, because realizing that the Italian front was A, in the mountains, and B, much of the difficulty occurred during the winter, there was a decision to boost the mountain troops.
Austria did more than simply boost its troops. Thanks to one man, operating out of the country's Arlberg Mountains, it midwifed the birth of a technique that, once the war was over, would change skiing forever.
One of the reasons why skiing took off in the 1920s was largely because of the success one particular man, Hannes Schneider, had teaching troops how to ski on the Italian front. He and his mentor, they would take a group of men, let's say 40 men, teach them how to ski, meaning really not ski fast or anything, but ski steadily and be able to do marches on skis and climb on skis, herringboning and so on. And at the end of that, they would keep maybe 3 or 4 ones who had done rather well and turn them into instructors. So what actually Schneider was doing during the war was providing a form of instruction which made for a form of skiing, which made for the growth of skiing after the war, because he applied his military way of skiing to civilians. Schneider was one of the earliest people who seemed to recognize, and I'm now quoting, that speed is the lure, not touring. By, let's say, 1922, the technique that he had produced, which became known almost instantly as the Arlberg technique, was both a way to teach, a way to learn, and finally, a way to ski. And it was rather different from the way Norwegians skied. The Norwegians came down their hills in rather swoopy telemark turns. Schneider came down his hills with a low crouch and a lift and swing into the turn, one turn after the other, with a fair amount of speed attached to it. And it is at that sort of moment that you begin to get the real divergence between Nordic, of course it wasn't called Nordic skiing, there was only skiing, but we begin to get the divergence between the way that the Norwegians skied and the way that Schneider skied. After the First World War, there was a competition to win the peace, as the French said. And to win the peace really meant getting tourists there. And so what happened to ski schools was one of two things. The one thing was that the Arlberg became so ubiquitous and so admired that, as the London Times said at one stage, it seems to be impossible to tamper with it. It was the word. And it was the word largely because it was also made a requirement for school education teachers in the Land Tyrol, in the various sections of Austria, and then Germans from the south, particularly from Kempten area and Garmisch area, came, and it became the way to ski. There was a Arlberg school in Paris, there was an Arlberg school in London, and when some instructors from Hannes Schneider's ski school came over to New Hampshire, you find Benno Rybicka, who was one of his leading instructors, managing the American branch of the Hannes Schneider ski school in North Conway. Into that mix comes probably the more important person, and this is Arnold Lund, who was really a mountaineer before he got hurt, and who made of a couple of places in Switzerland a sort of Rock of Gibraltar, a sort of a British enclave. And he liked the idea of mountains very much. He was a lover of mountains. what he found was this, that if you climbed up a mountain, you of course left your valley floor, which was farmland. Then you walked through the woods and up you went, and then you came to tree line, and then the top was open for another, 1,000 feet or however. So mountaineers climbing up would have to have two sorts of skiing in order to get to the bottom again. One would be the down mountain skiing, the straight, it used to be called the straight race. So that the top of the mountain to the tree line was one sort of skiing. But then you had what he called tricky tree running. And in order to make that possible for practice, what you do is you get a hill, put some branches in the way, and make what became called a slalom out of it. Slalom, lam in Norwegian means a track, and slalom means going around obstacles. It was all done to kind of bring the level of skiing up to a certain stage where you could enjoy yourself in the mountains. And he promoted this increasingly in the early 1920s.
Thanks to Arnold Lund's races and Hannes Schneider's techniques, alpine skiing became increasingly popular in Europe. As Austrian instructors versed in the Auerberg school came to America to teach, the Nordic dominance of skiing in this country began to be displaced. Other factors were at play as well. The Dartmouth Outing Club had been formed in 1909 by Fred Harris, a student who, by his own account, had skiing on the brain. As the DOC developed, it became the focus of collegiate skiing in America, creating a model that other universities could and did emulate, and connecting the sport to the affluent and elite.
The outdoors was part of a possibility for the educated. However, what Fred Harris did and what the Dartmouth Outing Club did was to provide a framework which could be easily copied, and indeed was copied. UNH, Middlebury, Williams, and Yale, Harvard, Cornell. This is the Ivy League stuff, or if not Ivy League, very near Ivy League stuff.
The DOC organized the country's first downhill and slalom races in the mid to late 1920s. As Dartmouth held and won more and more such races, it influenced the National Ski Association to sanction them for the first time, further disrupting Nordic preeminence. By the early 1930s, the college had become the unparalleled leader in American skiing.
Alpine racing became increasingly important in the winter circuit. And who won all the Alpine races? Basically Dartmouth. Four Dartmouth people were on the Olympic team in 1936. And so it becomes very influential.
It also installed a succession of coaches who continued to mold the club into the country's unparalleled alpine powerhouse. There was another club that played an important role in the alpine skiing invasion. The Appalachian Mountain Club, which was headquartered in Boston, had been established in 1876 to promote exploration and conservation of nearby wilderness areas, and in particular, the pristine White Mountains of New Hampshire. It, too, was the province of the well-to-do, who, as economic prosperity swept the country in the 1920s, vacationed in the Alps on winter holiday. In 1928, AMC member Wilhelmine Wright traveled to Kitzbühel, Austria, where she was introduced to the Auerberg technique firsthand. Upon her return, she wrote an article on alpine skiing in Appalachia, the AMC's publication, that began to socialize the method amongst its membership. That same year, the AMC began offering club instruction and brought Otto Schneebs, a German-born skier and the author of several influential books on the topic, to teach its members to ski. Cost, 25 cents an hour for a 2-hour lesson. Auerberg began to catch fire throughout the East Coast. In 1930, when Schneebs was hired by Dartmouth College as the coach of its ski team and propelled the college to the vanguard of American skiing, that fire began to burn hotter. As the equipment from the 1920s began to improve to accommodate alpine skiing, a more sophisticated ski with steel edges appeared on the scene, accompanied by tighter bindings and stiffer boots. Ski clubs that doubled as social clubs sprung up, helping to establish a tone for the increasingly popular sport. And that tone had a decided German accent. World War I had made the U.S. the world's banker, and when America sneezed, the world caught a cold. As the October 1929 stock market crash plunged the country into an economic tailspin, the ripple effect engulfed Europe. Mass unemployment, hyperinflation, the collapse of industrial output and trade Bank closures and mass poverty led to increasingly turbulent domestic politics, including, as we discussed in our last episode, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. For those appalled by the racist, totalitarian fascism that defined the party, and for Jews in particular, the writing was on the wall. Get out of Europe if, and while, you still could. The resulting exodus included alpine skiers, instructors, and mountaineers who arrived in America to escape Hitler's malignant nationalism. Hans Schneider was one of them. An outspoken critic of the Nazis, Schneider had been stripped of his ski school and imprisoned following the Anschluss, as Germany's 1938 annexation of Austria is known. A masterclass in international relations not only managed to free Schneider from house arrest, but to bring him to North Conway, New Hampshire, where he reopened his ski school to American clients. Hitler's loss was America's gain. Not only would Schneider go on to teach the Arborg technique to Americans out of North Conway for another 15 years, he would also go on to teach it to the soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division, in which his son Herbert would serve as well. As the Arborg technique flourished around the country, the German language became synonymous with skiing, displacing Norwegian as the sport's mother tongue. Schneider had imbued his method of teaching with military precision, and the German and Austrian instructors, who taught it to Americans, beat the same regimented approach into their students. But the Teutonic rigor did nothing to diminish the sport's growing popularity. Neither did the Depression. In fact, it became instrumental to skiing's growth. Fiscal policies enacted by President Roosevelt helped to lay the sport's infrastructural foundation. The Civilian Conservation Corps went to work building ski trails in the East. In the West, where much of the desirable ski terrain lay on public lands, chambers of commerce lobbied the federal government to open them to skiing and to help underwrite the cost of development. As the revenue generated by skiing justified the expenditures necessary to keep roads open, winter snow removal took place in smaller, more remote communities for the first time. Despite, or because of the Depression, the business of skiing began to boom. Here's Paul Petzoldt again.
But the real reason the ski areas were started was that the railroads wanted to get more passengers on their trains.
People had carried their skis on trains way before 1931, but the snow train era begins largely as a result of a couple of people in the AMC and the Dartmouth Outing Club of Boston who have had experience on snow trains in Germany. They'd been there and they'd seen this happening, and then they say, well, why can't we do this from Boston? And so they get the ear of people in the Boston and Maine who are looking very desperately to keep alive during the Depression. But in January of 1931, 197 people get onto the train in Boston, and they go to a place called Warner, New Hampshire. The natives of Warner don't like these people wandering around on our gardens. They look funny. They don't talk like we do. They don't like it. 3 weeks later, 923 people got out at Epping, New Hampshire. Epping is as flat as you can imagine. The Ladies' Aid Society was there. The Boy Scouts were there. The churches were open. The women's were providing lunches. Taxi drivers were there. The farmers were there with their carts and horses. And everybody had a wonderful time. New Hampshire had found a new winter business.
How much do I love these ski trains? Let me count the ways. First, the people getting on them sometimes didn't even know where they were going.
2 or 3 people who were the organizers, and they came from the AMC and the Dartmouth Outing Club. They had weather people dotted around in the various stations. Frequently, they were station masters of odd little towns, and they would be sent indications of what the snow depth was and so on and so forth. But what it meant was that these 2 or 3 people sitting around just said, okay, well, this week, let's go to Canaan. And it didn't matter at all that the person on the train knew they were going to Canaan. In fact, they probably didn't even know the name, because the train would go to Canaan, stop there, and be the lodge, as it were, a place where you left your clothes, you left your picnic, where you needed a rest, you came back and sat in your seat. You better make sure that you got on the train when it went back. That's the only thing that really was vital.
Second, the passengers didn't even necessarily know how to ski, or for that matter, have their own ski equipment or clothing.
Certain of the clubs would have actual instructors on the trains, and the instructor would sort of gather his group and take them off when they arrived at the particular destination. It became so sophisticated that a couple of shops used to have a train car literally for renting all equipment and all clothing. You could walk onto the train in your suit, and by the time you got off 2 hours later, you could be outfitted with skis, boots, poles, and clothing.
Third, the ski train's new clientele began to alter the socioeconomics of skiing.
Sociologists would probably call lower middle class. These are people who work in banks, tellers. These are people who perhaps are on the telephone exchanges. These are new to skiing people who make just about enough money so that they can spend the $2.10 it takes to get from Boston, let's say, to Plymouth, New Hampshire.
In 1939, a stenographer's average salary was $80 a month. Compare that with the costs of a 5-day ski trip to Franconia, New Hampshire, one of the country's emerging skiing hotspots. A pair of skis in 1939 cost $20, bindings were $10, boots $15, poles $10, a ski hat $2, parka $9, ski pants $11, socks $3.50, ski mitts $2.50. To get from Boston to Franconia cost $4 for a round-trip ticket. Use of the ski tow cost $1, and admission to the ski area cost another $1. Food and lodging were $5 a day, or $15 for a 5-night stay. Total cost $142. How are stenographers able to afford such a trip on their $80 a month salary?
They don't do it. They go up on the weekends, possibly only a one-day. I mean, there are a lot of one-day trains. They don't take week vacations. The people who do take those sorts of week vacations are the expensive types.
The expensive types were the wealthy, the Dartmouth graduates, the members of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and the ranks of the exclusive ski clubs that sprang up in urban centers around the country, such as the Amateur Ski Club of New York, of which Minnie Dole was a member. But the Minnie Doles of the world were already skiing. So here's another thing I love about the ski trains. The way they reached the new-to-skiing skiers was by promoting the ski train outings as
Suntan Special. They used to run it. They've advertised it as a Suntan Special.
Stuck in dreary Boston on yet another winter weekend? Rejoice! Now you can jump on the ski train and get both a suntan and a stem turn. The trains were an overnight sensation. 12 trains took 8,731 passengers out of Boston's North Station that very first season alone. From 1936 until 1940, the B&M delivered 174,622 ski passengers to their destinations. A new era had opened for New England skiing, and the idea quickly caught on.
The success of the B&M was not lost on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad out of New York City. In New York, out of Grand Central, the authorities had to cordon off the line for the ski trains because people came to watch these weird people carrying these boards, probably dressed in raccoon coats. They became a kind of a New York sight to see. There was also lines out of Chicago, and also there were lines going out of San Francisco.
And Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis, and Denver. To quote Dr. Allen from his book, all across snow country in the mid-1930s, trains took growing numbers of new skiers to a winter's day away from office and bench. As the ranks of skiers grew from coast to coast, another innovation made the pursuit irresistible.
The rope tow, first one on the continent, was up in Shawbridge, Quebec, and was basically copied at Woodstock in January of 34, and was an instant success. If you imagine skiing on a mountain, let's say it's 1,000-foot vertical, how many times do you walk up that? Once a day? Twice a day if you're young and healthy and so on. But it's hard work. The moment that you get a rope tow, then all of a sudden you ski an incredible amount more than you're used to. And that's what the rope tow did. Rope tows to begin with were pretty primitive. And little by little, they got fairly efficient. But as they got fairly efficient, other more sophisticated lifts began to appear. First the J-bar, then the T-bar. In the early days, that was called a he and she stick, which shows how social skiing had become. And then you get the chairlift, first one out in Sun Valley in Christmas of 1936. Second one probably in Laconia, New Hampshire in 38.
By the time John and Grove McCown were making their way up Paintbrush Canyon, skiing had become the fastest growing recreational activity in America. The government had helped to fund the infrastructure. The rope tows and chairlifts had made skiing convenient, social, and fun. The first ski journalists had started covering skiing for national magazines, socializing the concept further. To quote again from Dr. Allen, by 1940, Time magazine estimated the skiing population of the United States at 1 million. The Red Cross's estimate was 2 million. Another authority put the figure at 3 million. All the elements of an explosion in American skiing were in place before the war. But then, of course, Hitler intervened. At Fred Brown's insistence, the McCown brothers not only entered the 4th of July race that day in 1939 in Paintbrush Canyon. Grove took first, and John took second. "Ski race won by brothers at Teton National Park," read the headline on the front cover of the Jackson Hole's Courier the next day. Grove even got a blue ribbon, proclaiming him the 1939 Grand Teton National Park, second annual 4th of July slalom race champion. The hook was set. "We've decided to stay in Wyoming for the summer," Grove wrote home to their parents. "We have talked to Fred. He knows his oats, and he says the best summer skiing in the West is in the park's Cascade Canyon. Mount Baker would have to wait." And that concludes episode 2 of 90-Pound Rucksack. Thank you for listening. If you liked it, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and please share it. Tell a friend about it and give it 5 stars on your app. Sign up for the newsletter at christianbeckwith.com so you don't miss an update. And while you're there, check out the episode's additional content, including bios for all the new characters we introduced today. And if you're really into our story of the 10th Mountain Division, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons are the heart of 90-Pound Rucksack because they support the podcast's journalistic and educational objectives. In return, they receive access to unabridged versions of each episode, including exclusive interviews, supporting documentation, historic images, and behind-the-scenes content available only to them. Special thanks go out to our advisory board members, McKay Jenkins, Chris Jurgens, Jeff Leik, David Little, Sepp Scanlon, Kelly Schmidt, and Doug Schmidt for their help with this podcast, as well as to Dr. Allen for his contributions. Thanks to Tom Turiano for generously sharing the interview with Paul Petzoldt, and props to Roma Dashenko and Francisco Diaz for their help in putting this episode together. Until next time, thanks for joining, and I hope you get outside and do something wild today. Remember, climbing and ski mountaineering are dangerous, but without risk, there is no adventure. Have fun, stay safe, and stay in touch.